Canada, 2021. Part 1. A Quiet Town's Heroine. Jasper was a town that rarely made headlines. A peaceful sanctuary surrounded by dense forests and towering mountains. The air was crisp, the kind that kissed your skin with the freshness of untouched nature. This town, nestled in the Canadian Rockies, was where Sarah Robertson had lived her entire life. It was a place where neighbors knew each other's names, where time seemed to move slower, and where the rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons and the occasional howling wind. Sarah's home sat at the edge of town, a modest house with faded blue shutters and a creaky wooden porch. From her kitchen window, she could see the morning mist rolling off the mountains, slowly revealing the tops of pine trees that stretched endlessly toward the sky. This view had always brought her peace, but today, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Sarah felt only a heavy stillness within her. She sat alone at the kitchen table, the smell of brewed coffee filling the air, but her cup remained untouched. Her hands rested limply on the worn surface of the table, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wood as her mind wandered far from the comfort of her home. It had been months since she had felt any real sense of peace, any connection to the faith she once held so dear. At 29, Sarah was no stranger to the fragility of life. She had been a paramedic for nearly 7 years, racing through the quiet streets of Jasper and the winding mountain roads to answer emergency calls. It was a job that had defined her, given her a purpose. But lately, that purpose felt distant, like something she could no longer reach. Her mind drifted back to the call that had shaken her faith, the night she had lost Tom Hansen. He had been a regular at the local diner, always greeting her with a warm smile whenever she stopped in for a coffee during her shifts. Tom was the kind of man who made you feel like you mattered, no matter how small your interaction. When the call came in about his heart attack, Sarah had felt an urgency she hadn't experienced in a long time. The sound of the siren still echoed in her memory, the flashing red lights illuminating the narrow streets as they raced to his home. When they arrived, she had been focused, determined. But despite everything, her training, her experience, and even her desperate prayers, Tom had died on the way to the hospital. She had felt him slip away, the life leaving his body like sand through her fingers. The weight of that failure had settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake it. She had replayed the events of that night over and over in her mind, searching for something she could have done differently. But each time, she came up empty, and with every unanswered question, her faith eroded a little more. Sarah had grown up in a devout Christian household. Her parents had instilled in her a deep belief in God, a faith that had carried her through the toughest moments of her life. She had prayed before every shift, asking for guidance, for strength, for the ability to save those in need. But after Tom's death, those prayers stopped. She had stopped believing that they made any difference. Now, as she sat in the quiet of her kitchen, the weight of her disbelief pressed down on her. It wasn't just the loss of Tom that haunted her. It was the silence that followed. She had expected to feel something, some sign of God's presence, some comfort in the aftermath. But there had been nothing, just emptiness. Her gaze shifted to the small cross that hung on the wall above the kitchen doorway. It had been her grandmother's, passed down to her after she had died. Sarah had always found solace in that cross, a reminder of the faith that had been woven into the fabric of her family for generations. But now, it felt like a relic of a belief she no longer understood. The morning light slowly filtered into the room, casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah sighed deeply, rubbing her hands over her face as if trying to wipe away the exhaustion that clung to her. Her shift started in an hour, and yet she felt no motivation to move. The idea of putting on her paramedic uniform, of stepping back into the role of the town's hero, felt like a burden she wasn't sure she could carry today. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It was Marcus, her partner and friend, asking if she was ready for their shift. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing a quick reply. On my way. She stood slowly, her body heavy with fatigue, and walked over to the counter where her uniform lay neatly folded. The fabric felt stiff in her hands as she picked it up, running her fingers over the embroidered patch that read Jasper Emergency Services. It was a uniform she had once worn with pride, a symbol of the life she had chosen. But now it felt more like a costume, a role she played rather than a purpose she lived. As she dressed, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at her looked the same. Same short brown hair, same sharp eyes, same determined set of her jaw. But behind those eyes, there was a weariness that hadn't been there before. A doubt that had taken root and grown like a vine, wrapping itself around her heart and squeezing until it was hard to breathe. The knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. It was Marcus, punctual as always. He stood on the porch, his tall frame leaning casually against the doorframe, his face creased with a smile. But even his easygoing demeanor couldn't mask the concern in his eyes. "Ready for another day of saving the world?" he asked, his tone light, but Sarah could hear the undercurrent of sincerity. She forced a smile and nodded, stepping out into the cool morning air. The familiar scent of pine and earth filled her lungs, grounding her in the present, if only for a moment. As they walked toward the ambulance parked in the driveway, Marcus glanced at her, his voice softer now. "You've been distant lately," he said, not accusing but concerned. "Is everything okay?" Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle of the ambulance. She wanted to tell him everything, the doubt, the guilt, the loss of faith that had been gnawing at her. But the words felt too heavy, too complicated. So instead, she just shrugged, offering a vague, "Just tired." Marcus didn't press. He never did. He simply nodded, understanding in his silence. They climbed into the ambulance, the engine roaring to life as they set off for the station. The streets were quiet, the sun slowly rising over the mountains, casting long shadows across the road. As they drove, Sarah's thoughts drifted once again to Tom, to the man she couldn't save, and to the God she no longer believed was listening. The town may have seen her as a hero, but Sarah felt like anything but. Part 2. A Call in the Night. The sky had turned from the soft hues of a quiet Canadian sunset to the deep indigo of night as Sarah and Marcus arrived at the ambulance station. It was a place Sarah knew like the back of her hand. Its familiar hum of radios, the sterile scent of disinfectant, the low buzz of tired conversation between paramedics waiting for the next call. Despite the long hours she had spent here over the years, tonight felt different. There was an uneasiness in the air that she couldn't quite place. The station itself was small, tucked at the edge of town, flanked by dense forest on one side and the open highway on the other. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly as Sarah and Marcus walked through the door, adding to the eerie stillness that seemed to hang over the place. The break room, where they usually shared coffee and quiet conversations between calls, felt unusually empty tonight, save for the distant hum of the vending machine in the corner. Marcus set his bag down on the table, flashing his easy grin. "Quiet night so far," he remarked, leaning back in one of the old, worn-out chairs. "Let's hope it stays that way." Sarah managed a half-hearted smile as she sat across from him. She had grown accustomed to Marcus's optimism over the years, his ability to find lightness even in the most intense situations. But tonight, her own heart was heavy, weighed down by the lingering doubts and the fatigue that seemed to seep into her bones. They settled into a familiar rhythm, small talk, sips of coffee, the occasional banter about the town's local happenings. But even as they spoke, Sarah felt herself drifting, her mind wandering to darker places. She thought of all the calls she had responded to over the years, the lives she had touched, and the lives she had lost. No matter how much experience she gained, the weight of those losses never got easier. Suddenly, the sound of the dispatch radio crackled to life, cutting through the quiet. Both Sarah and Marcus tensed, their light conversation forgotten as they listened intently to the voice on the other end. "Unit 7, we have a code red, motor vehicle accident on Highway 16. One adult, One child, possible critical condition. Respond immediately. Sarah's heart sank at the mention of a child. It was always harder when a young life was involved. Without a word, she and Marcus were on their feet, moving with the swift precision of years of practice. They grabbed their gear and rushed out to the ambulance, the cold night air biting at their skin as they moved. The drive to the accident site was tense. The sirens wailed into the darkness, casting red and blue flashes against the trees as they sped down the narrow, winding road. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, gripping the handle on the door as Marcus navigated the turns with practiced skill. The sound of the radio buzzed softly in the background, dispatchers coordinating other units, but Sarah's focus was on the task ahead. Her mind raced as she mentally prepared for what they might encounter. She had been to hundreds of accident scenes before, but each one was different. Each one brought its own set of challenges. And this one involved a child. She could feel the knot tightening in her stomach at the thought of what they might find. They reached the scene within minutes, though it felt like hours had passed in the tense silence of the ride. As they approached, the flashing lights of police cars and fire trucks illuminated the twisted wreckage of a car that had skidded off the road and slammed into a tree. The front of the vehicle was crumpled beyond recognition, and smoke billowed from the engine, mixing with the cold night air. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as they pulled up. She could see other first responders already at the scene, but the urgency of the situation was palpable. As soon as the ambulance stopped, Sarah and Marcus jumped out, grabbing their gear as they rushed toward the wreckage. The driver, an adult male, was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but alive. A quick assessment told Sarah that his injuries, though serious, weren't immediately life-threatening. But it wasn't him she was worried about. Her eyes quickly moved to the back seat, where the real danger lay. Through the shattered window, Sarah saw the small, fragile form of a boy no older than 6. He was still, too still, his head resting at an unnatural angle against the seatbelt. Blood matted his blonde hair, and his pale face looked eerily peaceful in the chaos around him. Her breath caught in her throat as she rushed to the door, her hands shaking only slightly as she worked to free him from the wreckage. Marcus was right beside her, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a focused intensity. Together, they carefully pulled the boy from the car, laying him on the ground as Sarah began her assessment. His pulse was faint, his breathing shallow, and his small chest barely moved beneath the layers of his clothing. "Stay with me, buddy," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she worked to stabilize him. Her hands moved automatically, years of training kicking in as she checked his vitals, adjusted his airway, and applied pressure to the wounds. But despite everything, there was a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. He was slipping away. The sound of the ambulance siren seemed distant now, drowned out by the pounding of Sarah's own heartbeat in her ears. She could feel the urgency in every fiber of her being, the knowledge that time was running out. They needed to get him to the hospital fast. Marcus, sensing the same urgency, was already preparing the stretcher, his movements quick and efficient. "We got to move, Sarah," he said, his voice low and tense. She nodded, her focus entirely on the boy as they carefully lifted him onto the stretcher and rushed him toward the ambulance. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was tense, charged with a sense of desperation. Sarah worked quickly, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. Marcus was in the driver's seat, already speeding toward the hospital, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. In the back of the ambulance, Sarah knelt beside the boy, her hands working to keep him stable. She monitored his vitals, her eyes flicking between the heart monitor and his fragile form. The hum of the engine and the wail of the sirens faded into the background as she focused on the child in front of her. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah found herself praying. It was a quiet, desperate prayer, whispered under her breath as she worked. "Please, God, don't take him. Not him. Not like this." She hadn't prayed in months. The weight of her doubt had been too heavy, the silence from above too deafening. But now, in the back of that ambulance, with a life hanging in the balance, Sarah felt something stir inside her, something she had thought was long gone. A flicker of faith, a small, fragile hope. As they raced through the dark streets, Sarah kept her hands steady, her heart pounding in time with the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. She could feel the fragility of life in the small boy's body, the delicate balance between life and death. And in that moment, she realized just how little control she had. All she could do was her best, and pray that it would be enough. The lights of the hospital appeared in the distance, a beacon in the night, and Sarah's pulse quickened. They were so close. Just a few more minutes. But as the ambulance rounded a sharp bend, something went wrong. The tires skidded on the icy road, and Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as the ambulance began to slide, veering dangerously close to the edge of a steep ravine. Her breath caught in her throat as the world seemed to tilt around her, the back of the ambulance lurching violently. For a split second, everything slowed. She could see the boy's still form, the flashing lights outside the window, and the dark abyss waiting below if they went over the edge. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the slide stopped. The ambulance, teetering on the edge of the ravine, somehow came to a halt, as if held by an invisible force. Part 3. Racing Against Time. The interior of the ambulance was bathed in the eerie glow of the flashing red and blue lights, flickering across the equipment and casting fleeting shadows across Sarah's face. The steady beep of the heart monitor provided the only rhythm against the chaos, but even that was fragile, too slow, too faint. The boy lay on the stretcher, his small frame almost swallowed by the medical equipment surrounding him, and Sarah's pulse seemed to match the stuttering rhythm of his heart. The icy breath of the Canadian winter had followed them into the vehicle, leaving a cold chill in the air. Despite the warmth from the heaters, Sarah felt a shiver run through her. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she checked the boy's vitals again, but her mind was racing. Time was running out, and every second counted. The child's pulse was fading, his breathing shallow, and though she was doing everything in her power to keep him stable, there was a tightening in her chest that she couldn't ignore. Marcus's voice crackled over the intercom from the driver's seat. "Sarah, how's he doing back there?" His voice was strained, urgent, but calm. Marcus was always calm in moments like this, the kind of professional who could maintain his composure even in the face of disaster. Sarah glanced at the heart monitor again, the numbers dipping dangerously low. "Not good," she called back, her voice tight with the pressure of the moment. "We need to get there faster, Marcus. He's slipping." Marcus didn't respond, but Sarah felt the ambulance lurch forward as he pushed the vehicle harder, the engine roaring against the freezing air. She could feel the wheels slipping occasionally on the slick road, and with every curve they took, her heart jumped into her throat. But there was no time for fear. Her focus had to be on the boy in front of her. The child's skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh ambulance lights. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment his chest stopped moving altogether. Sarah's heart clenched. "Come on," she whispered under her breath, leaning closer as she adjusted the oxygen mask over his face. "Stay with me." It was in these moments, the quiet, desperate ones, that Sarah used to pray. Before her faith had crumbled, before doubt had sunk its claws into her heart, she would have whispered a prayer, asking for divine intervention. But now, as the boy hovered between life and death, Sarah found herself clinging to something else: her skills, her training. She pushed aside the rising panic and forced herself to focus. She adjusted the four, checking the flow of fluids, her hands steady despite the tremor of fear gnawing at the edges of her resolve. The boy's tiny hand lay limp against the white sheets, and Sarah couldn't help but think of how unfair it all was. A child so small, so innocent, fighting for his life on a cold night in the back of an ambulance. It wasn't right, and yet, in this line of work, she had seen the unfairness of life play out time and time again. But this felt different. The ambulance hit another patch of ice, and Sarah was thrown slightly to the side as the vehicle swerved. Her heart leaped into her throat, but Marcus regained control quickly, his voice crackling back through the intercom. "We're almost there. Hang in there." Sarah barely registered his words. Her entire focus was on the boy. The heart monitor beeped again, slower this time. Too slow. Her pulse quickened as she grabbed the defibrillator, her mind racing through the steps she had rehearsed hundreds of times. She knew what to do. She had done this before. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the stakes felt higher, the consequences heavier. She placed the paddles on the boy's chest, her breath catching as she prepared to administer the shock. Her fingers hovered over the button for a split second longer than they should have, doubt flickering in her mind. Was this enough? Was she enough? The questions, the doubts, pressed in on her like a weight, but there was no time to dwell on them. She pressed the button. The boy's body jerked slightly, but the heart monitor remained the same. Too slow, too faint. "Come on," Sarah whispered again, her voice breaking as she prepared to try again. "Don't give up on me now." She was about to press the button when the ambulance lurched violently to the side. The vehicle slid across the icy road, and for a moment, Sarah lost her balance, grabbing onto the stretcher to steady herself. The heart monitor's steady beeping was drowned out by the screech of tires as the ambulance swerved dangerously close to the edge of the road. Through the small window at the back of the vehicle, Sarah could see the ravine below, a black void that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. Her breath caught in her throat, and time seemed to slow. She could feel the ambulance teetering on the edge, the weight of the vehicle shifting precariously as Marcus fought to regain control. In that moment, the cold, clinical focus that Sarah had maintained throughout the night shattered. Fear gripped her, and for the first time in months, she found herself reaching out to something beyond herself. "God, please." The words slipped from her lips before she could stop them, a quiet prayer lost in the chaos. She hadn't prayed in so long, hadn't believed that it would make a difference. But now, with the life of an innocent child hanging in the balance, and her own life teetering on the edge of that ravine, she felt the desperation rise within her. The ambulance tipped further, the back end sliding closer to the edge. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her hands gripping the stretcher as if it were the only thing grounding her in the chaos. And then, just as suddenly as the slide had begun, it stopped. For a moment, there was silence. The ambulance was still. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. They should have gone over the edge. The momentum, the ice, it should have sent them tumbling into the darkness below. But somehow they hadn't. Somehow they were still here. Sarah's hands trembled as she let go of the stretcher, her eyes wide as she glanced toward the front of the ambulance. "Marcus," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how." Marcus's voice crackled through the intercom, his tone laced with disbelief. "But we stopped. We should have gone over, but we didn't." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process what had just happened. There was no logical explanation. The vehicle had been sliding. There was no way it should have stopped on its own. Yet here they were, balanced precariously on the edge, but safe. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt something stir deep within her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. It was faint, fragile, but undeniable. It was faith. She didn't know what had just happened, or how they had avoided disaster. But in that moment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't been alone in that ambulance. Someone had been there watching over them, keeping them from falling into the abyss. With shaking hands, Sarah returned her focus to the boy on the stretcher. His pulse was still weak, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. And somehow, against all odds, they had been given another chance. "Let's get him to the hospital," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Marcus. But there was a new strength in her voice now, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The ambulance roared to life again, the engine growling as Marcus carefully maneuvered them back onto the road. As they sped toward the hospital, the lights of the town finally appearing in the distance, Sarah couldn't help but glance out the window once more, toward the ravine that had nearly claimed them. She didn't have the answers. Not yet, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to believe that maybe, just maybe, something greater was at work. Part 4. The Light in the Darkness. The ambulance screeched to a halt in the hospital parking lot, the floodlights casting harsh beams across the vehicle as the emergency doors swung open. Sarah barely noticed the bustle of activity outside as nurses and doctors rushed to meet them. Her entire focus remained on the boy, who still clung to life by the thinnest thread. She had kept him alive this long, but she knew their fight wasn't over yet. The cold air hit her face as she stepped out of the ambulance, helping to transfer the boy onto a gurney. His small body seemed even more fragile under the hospital's fluorescent lights, and the weight of his fate pressed heavily on her chest. Nurses buzzed around, shouting orders, but their voices were distant to Sarah, muffled by the sheer intensity of the moment. "He's in critical condition," Sarah called out to the trauma team, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Severe head trauma, possible internal bleeding. His pulse is weak, but he's still with us." The doctors moved in, swiftly taking over as they wheeled the boy through the automatic doors and into the emergency room. Sarah followed for a few steps, but eventually, she was forced to stop, standing in the sterile hallway as the doors swung shut behind them. She watched through the small windows as the team worked, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline. For the first time in hours, she wasn't in control, and that helplessness gnawed at her. Marcus appeared beside her, his face drawn and tired but calm, as always. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You did everything you could, Sarah," he said, his voice low and comforting. "He's got a fighting chance because of you." Sarah nodded, but the words did little to soothe her. She wasn't sure if it was enough. The boy had been so close to death. She could still feel his fragile pulse against her fingers, the way his tiny chest barely rose and fell. And then there was the ambulance, the slide toward the ravine, the way it had stopped, something that still sent chills down her spine every time she thought about it. "I don't understand what happened back there," she whispered, more to herself than to Marcus. Her eyes remained fixed on the trauma room doors, watching the blur of movement inside. "We should have gone over the edge. We were sliding." And then her voice trailed off, unsure of how to describe what she had felt. It was like something was holding us up. Marcus turned his gaze toward her, his expression thoughtful. "You're not the only one who felt it," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "I don't know what it was, but something kept us from going over." Sarah swallowed hard, her thoughts swirling with everything that had happened that night. The ambulance, the boy, the prayer that had slipped from her lips without her even realizing it. She hadn't prayed in months, not since Tom's death. But in that moment of fear and desperation, she had called out to something, someone, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her prayer had been heard. She turned to Marcus, searching for some sort of explanation in his calm demeanor. "Do you really think it was—" She hesitated, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "Do you think it was divine intervention?" Marcus shrugged slightly, but there was a softness in his expression that suggested he believed something extraordinary had happened. "I've seen a lot of things in this job, Sarah. Things that don't make sense. But tonight, yeah, I think something was watching over us." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Sarah wasn't sure what to say. The rational part of her mind wanted to dismiss the idea, to explain it away as a coincidence, a stroke of luck. But deep down, in a place she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge for months, she felt the stirrings of something she had long since buried: faith. Before she could respond, a nurse emerged from the trauma room, her face neutral but tired. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she straightened, her heart pounding. "How is he?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The nurse gave a small, encouraging smile. "He's stabilized for now, but it's still touch and go. We're monitoring him closely. It's going to be a long night, but he's a fighter." Relief washed over Sarah like a wave, her body sagging slightly as the tension released from her shoulders. The boy was alive. It wasn't over yet, but he had made it this far, and that was something. She nodded at the nurse, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." As the nurse disappeared back into the room, Marcus placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. "You gave him a chance." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her mind was still turning over everything that had happened, everything that she had felt. The boy's fragile life hanging in the balance, the ambulance sliding toward the ravine, the invisible force that had stopped them. And then the prayer, the desperate, instinctual prayer that she had spoken without even thinking. It had been so long since she had felt anything close to faith. After Tom's death, she had stopped believing that her prayers mattered. that God was even listening. But now she wasn't so sure. Something had happened tonight, something that defied explanation. And maybe, just maybe, it had been a sign that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. "I need a minute," Sarah said quietly, pulling away from Marcus and stepping outside into the cold night air. Outside, the hospital parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered cars and the glowing streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The sky above was clear, the stars twinkling against the vast, inky blackness. The crisp air filled her lungs as Sarah stood by the ambulance, the events of the night replaying in her mind. She could still feel the rush of adrenaline, the fear that had gripped her as the ambulance slid toward the edge. But more than that, she could feel the moment when everything had changed. The moment when the slide had stopped and something beyond her understanding had intervened. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she closed her eyes, leaning against the side of the ambulance. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to be still, to feel. And in that stillness, a quiet voice rose up from the depths of her heart. It wasn't loud or demanding. It wasn't an answer to all of her questions. But it was there, a flicker of hope, a spark of something she had thought she had lost. Faith. For so long, Sarah had wrestled with her doubts, her fears, her anger at a God she had felt had abandoned her. But tonight, standing in the cold silence of the hospital parking lot, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. God had never left her. Even in her darkest moments, he had been there, waiting, watching. And when she had reached out to him in desperation, he had answered. Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. Instead, she stood there, letting the emotions wash over her. Relief, gratitude, hope. For the first time in months, she felt whole. A soft breeze stirred the air, and in the distance, the faint glow of dawn began to peek over the horizon. Sarah watched as the first light of morning touched the edges of the sky, painting the darkness with shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful, and in that moment, she knew that no matter what happened, no matter how the night ended, she would be okay. She turned back toward the hospital, the warmth of hope settling in her chest. Part 5. Under the Angel's Wings. The sun was just beginning to rise when Sarah finally made her way back home. The pale light of dawn stretched across the horizon, casting a soft glow over the quiet streets of Jasper. The town, still asleep, was wrapped in the peace of early morning, the only sounds being the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds waking to greet the day. Sarah's feet dragged slightly as she approached her house, the weight of the night hanging heavily on her shoulders. Her body was exhausted, her muscles aching from the hours of tension, but there was something else stirring within her. Something new, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just relief, though that was there. It was something deeper, a sense of connection, of purpose that had been missing for so long. Her house, with its familiar creaky steps and weathered porch, looked the same as it had every other morning when she returned from a long shift. But today, as she stepped onto the porch, there was a sense of peace in the air that hadn't been there before. She paused for a moment, resting her hand on the wooden railing, letting the quiet wash over her. The events of the night played through her mind. The accident, the boy's fight for survival, and the moment that had changed everything. She pushed open the door, stepping into the warmth of her home. The familiar scent of pine and cedar greeted her, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of comfort in being here. It wasn't just a place to sleep anymore. It felt like a sanctuary, a space where she could breathe and begin to process everything that had happened. Sarah dropped her keys on the small table by the door and moved toward the kitchen. The coffee from earlier was still sitting on the counter, cold and untouched, a reminder of the person she had been just a few hours ago, lost, uncertain, full of doubt. She poured it out, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain before grabbing a fresh cup and sitting at the kitchen table, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. As she sipped the hot coffee, Sarah allowed her thoughts to wander back to the boy. The hospital had promised to keep her updated on his condition, and though it was still too soon to know if he would fully recover, the fact that he was alive felt like a miracle. She could still feel the weight of his small hand in hers, the fragility of his life balanced so delicately between survival and loss. It wasn't just the boy's life that had been on the line that night, though. Sarah knew that something else had shifted within her. She had been standing at the edge of her own cliff, teetering on the brink of losing her faith completely. And yet, in the darkest moment, someone had pulled her back. Her eyes drifted to the small cross hanging on the wall above the kitchen doorway, the one that had once belonged to her grandmother. For so long, that cross had been a symbol of the faith that had carried her through the hardest times of her life. But after losing Tom, after feeling like her prayers had gone unanswered, Sarah had turned away from it, from the comfort it once brought her. She had stopped praying, stopped believing that God was listening. But last night had been different. It wasn't just a near accident, the way the ambulance had stopped just before plunging into the ravine. It was the feeling that had come over her in that moment. The undeniable sense that they weren't alone, that something greater was holding them up, keeping them safe. She had prayed. Without thinking, without hesitation, she had reached out to God in the moment of her deepest fear. And he had answered. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as the realization sank in. She had spent so many months pushing God away, refusing to believe that he was still there, still watching over her. And yet, he had never left. Even in her doubt, even in her anger, he had been there, waiting for her to return to him. Sarah wiped the tears from her eyes, a small, bittersweet smile playing on her lips. It wasn't the first time she had faced a moment like this. Her career as a paramedic had given her plenty of opportunities to question the nature of life and death, of faith and loss. But this time it felt different. This time it wasn't just about the boy or the accident. It was about her, about finding her way back to the faith that had always been a part of her, even when she had tried to deny it. The events of the night had changed her, in more ways than she could fully understand. But as the light of morning began to fill the room, Sarah knew one thing for certain. She wasn't lost anymore. She had found her way back, and with that came a renewed sense of purpose, of peace. As she sat there, sipping her coffee, Sarah allowed herself to reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The doubts, the pain, the anger, all of it had been real, and all of it had shaped her. But now, she could see that it had also led her to something greater. It had led her to a deeper understanding of faith, of the way God worked in her life, even when she couldn't see it. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the quiet. It was a message from Marcus, checking in to see how she was doing after the long night. Sarah smiled as she read the message, grateful for his friendship, for the way he had stood by her through it all. "You okay?" The message read. "Long night, huh?" Sarah's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she typed a reply. "Yeah, I'm okay. Better than okay. Actually," she hit send, and as she set the phone down, a sense of calm settled over her. She was okay. For the first time in months, she felt whole, at peace. The road ahead might still be filled with challenges, with moments of doubt and uncertainty, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She knew she wasn't walking it alone. Standing up from the table, Sarah walked over to the small cross on the wall. She reached up, her fingers brushing the smooth wood as a quiet prayer formed on her lips. It wasn't a desperate prayer like the one she had whispered in the ambulance. It was a prayer of gratitude, of hope, of faith. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet of the morning. And as she stood there, the first rays of sunlight spilling into the room, Sarah knew that she was ready to face whatever came next, ready to continue her work, not just as a paramedic, but as someone who believed again, someone who knew, deep down, that she was protected, that she was loved, that in the darkest moments, she had been carried on the wings of angels. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.